The taste of blood mixed with sawdust filled Marcus Rodriguez's mouth as he spat onto the canvas floor of Murphy's boxing gym, his hands wrapped in tape that had turned crimson from 3 hours of relentless training. The heavy bag still swayed. From his final combination, each impact echoing through the dimly lit space like thunder. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Tomorrow, he would step into the ring at Madison Square Garden as the youngest heavyweight contender in a decade. But tonight, all he could think about was the classroom where it all began, where Tommy Brennan and his crew had cornered him against the chalkboard, mimicking his stutter until the entire class erupted in laughter. They had no idea that the boy who couldn't say his own name without stumbling would one day speak with his fists in the most eloquent language the boxing world had ever witnessed. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked pavement of Roosevelt High School as Marcus Rodriguez clutched his worn backpack straps, his knuckles white with tension. September 15th marked the beginning of his junior year, and already the familiar knot had formed in his stomach, the same one that appeared every time he knew he'd have to speak aloud. At 17, Marcus had perfected the art of invisibility, slipping through hallways like a ghost, timing his movements to avoid the clusters of students who gathered around lockers, their voices carrying the easy confidence he envied more than anything. His stutter had been with him for as long as he could remember, a constant companion that turned simple interactions into minefields of embarrassment. Words would catch in his throat like fishhooks, consonants piling up behind his teeth, until they spilled out in fractured syllables that drew stares and snickers. His mother, Elena Rodriguez, worked double shifts at the downtown diner to keep their small apartment in the Riverside district, and she'd saved for months to pay for speech therapy sessions that had helped somewhat, but not enough. Not nearly enough to give Marcus the voice he desperately wanted. Roosevelt High School sat in the heart of Millbrook, a working-class neighborhood where dreams were practical things, focused on steady jobs and stable futures rather than grand ambitions. The building itself was a monument to neglect, its red brick facade stained with decades of weather, windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in years, and a heating system that worked sporadically during the harsh New England winters. Inside, the hallways smelled of industrial disinfectant and adolescent anxiety, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry insects. Marcus navigated these corridors with the precision of a battlefield strategist, memorizing the routes that would take him from class to class with minimal human interaction. He knew which stairwells the popular kids avoided, which bathroom stalls offered the best refuge during lunch periods, and exactly how long he could linger at his locker before drawing unwanted attention. His schedule was carefully orchestrated to minimize the chances of being called upon in class, though teachers occasionally forgot his silent requests to be left alone. Tommy Brennan ruled Roosevelt High with the casual cruelty that came naturally to those blessed with easy charm and natural athleticism. At 6 feet tall with sandy brown hair that never seemed out of place and a smile that could disarm teachers and intimidate freshmen in equal measure, Tommy was everything Marcus wasn't. He quarterbacked the varsity football team, dated Sarah Mitchell, the head cheerleader who looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine, and moved through the school with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned his place in the world. Tommy's crew consisted of Jake Morrison, whose father owned 3 car dealerships across the county, and whose leather jacket cost more than Marcus's family spent on groceries in a month, and Brad Sullivan, a linebacker whose growth spurt had given him the build of a full-grown man at 17, but left his maturity somewhere around 13. Together, they formed a triangle of privilege and cruelty that had made Marcus's life miserable since freshman year, though their attention had intensified recently as Tommy's own insecurities began to surface with college applications looming. The incident that would change everything began in Mr. Peterson's American history class, A stuffy room on the third floor where ancient radiators clanged and wheezed throughout the period. Peterson was one of those teachers who believed that public humiliation was an effective teaching tool, calling on students randomly and expecting immediate, articulate responses. Marcus usually sat in the back corner, carefully positioned where Peterson's line of sight rarely fell. But on this particular Tuesday morning, fate had other plans. "Rodriguez," Peterson's voice cut through the classroom chatter like a blade. "Tell us about the significance of the Boston Tea Party in relation to colonial resistance movements." The room fell silent, 30 pairs of eyes turning toward Marcus like searchlights. His mouth went dry instantly, his throat constricting, as if someone had wrapped invisible hands around his neck. He could feel the familiar heat rising in his cheeks, the way his pulse quickened and his palms began to sweat. The words were there in his mind, clear and organized, but the journey from thought to speech felt like crossing a chasm on a tightrope. "The BB Boston Tea Party was," Marcus began, his voice barely above a whisper. The first few stutters drew some scattered glances, but as he struggled to form the simplest syllables, the attention became more intense, more predatory. It was a protest against the TT Act. Tommy Brennan's snicker was the first domino to fall. It started as a quiet sound, almost hidden behind a cough, but it grew bolder as Marcus continued to struggle with words that seemed to multiply in his mouth. Jake Morrison joined in next, his laughter slightly higher pitched, followed by the distinctive guffaw of Brad Sullivan. Within seconds, the entire class was fighting to contain their amusement, some hiding behind hands or textbooks, others openly staring with a mixture of pity and entertainment. "TPP party, Tommy," whispered just loud enough for the surrounding students to hear, mimicking Marcus's stutter with exaggerated facial expressions. Maybe he should try ordering at Starbucks. The laughter exploded then, a wave of sound that crashed over Marcus and left him drowning in humiliation. Peterson made a half-hearted attempt to restore order, but even he seemed to be fighting back a smile, his authority undermined by his own amusement at the spectacle. Marcus sat frozen in his chair, his mouth opening and closing silently like a fish gasping for air, the words he'd intended to speak dissolving into nothing. "That's enough," Peterson finally said, though his tone lacked any real conviction. "We'll move on. Thompson, can you answer the question?" But the damage was done. Marcus spent the rest of the period staring at his desk, his face burning with shame, while whispered imitations of his stutter rippled through the classroom like aftershocks. When the bell finally rang, he remained seated until the room emptied, gathering his things with shaking hands and wondering how he'd survive the rest of the day, let alone the rest of the school year. The hallway ambush came during the transition, between third and fourth periods, when the corridors were packed with students rushing to beat the late bell. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus had miscalculated his route, choosing speed over stealth, and found himself trapped in the main hallway when Tommy and his crew materialized from the crowd like sharks sensing blood in the water. "Hey, Tommy wants to talk to you," Jake Morrison called out, his voice carrying over the noise of slamming lockers and shuffling feet. Several students slowed their pace, sensing drama, while others actively moved closer to get a better view of whatever was about to unfold. Marcus tried to change direction, but Brad Sullivan had circled around behind him, using his massive frame to block any escape route. The three boys formed a triangle around Marcus, their positions calculated to create maximum humiliation, while maintaining plausible deniability if any teachers happened to notice. "We were just wondering," Tommy said, his voice dripping with false concern, "if you need help ordering lunch today. You know, since woo-w words are so hard for you." The crowd was growing now, drawn by the magnetic pull of cruelty that seemed to fascinate teenagers. Marcus could see phones appearing in peripheral vision, cameras turning in his direction as his humiliation became content for social media feeds. His backpack felt impossibly heavy on his shoulders, and his throat had closed up so completely that even breathing seemed difficult. "Come on, Marcus," Brad Sullivan joined in, his deep voice booming through the hallway. "Just say, please leave me alone. It's easy." Please," Jake Morrison added, his imitation so exaggerated it was almost theatrical. Please help me to talk like a normal person." The laughter was different this time, harder, and more vicious than in the classroom. This wasn't the polite tittering of students trying to stay under a teacher's radar. This was raw mob-like entertainment at Marcus's expense. He could see faces in the crowd, some laughing openly, others watching with uncomfortable expressions, but doing nothing to intervene. A few students looked genuinely sympathetic, but they remained silent, unwilling to risk becoming targets themselves. Marcus's vision began to blur at the edges, not from tears, but from something deeper, a rage that had been building for years and was finally reaching its breaking point. The voices around him became distorted, stretching and warping like a tape. Recording played at the wrong speed. His hands, which had been trembling moments before, suddenly steadied, and his breathing deepened despite the constriction in his throat. "What's the matter, Rodriguez?" Tommy pressed, stepping closer so that Marcus could smell his expensive cologne mixed with the lingering scent of the protein shake he'd consumed after first period. "Got your tongue?" That was when Marcus swung. The punch came from somewhere deep inside him, a place that had nothing to do with conscious thought or self-preservation. His right fist connected with Tommy Brennan's perfect nose with a sound like a hammer hitting raw meat, sending the quarterback stumbling backward into a bank of lockers with blood already streaming down his face. The hallway erupted in chaos. Students screamed and scattered, some pulling out phones to record the fight while others ran to find teachers or security. Brad Sullivan lunged forward with a roar of outrage, his massive hands reaching for Marcus's throat, but Marcus had already shifted his weight, ducking under the bigger boy's grasp and driving his shoulder into Brad's solar plexus, with enough force to double him over. Jake Morrison hesitated for a crucial second, torn between helping his friends and protecting his own face from Marcus's suddenly dangerous fists. That hesitation cost him dearly as Marcus pivoted and caught him with a left hook that sent him spinning into the crowd of onlookers, his leather jacket providing no protection against the explosion of violence that had transformed the quiet, stuttering boy into something feral and unpredictable. The fight lasted less than 30 seconds, but it felt like hours to everyone involved. When the dust settled, Tommy Brennan sat propped against the lockers with his hands cupped over his broken nose, blood seeping between his fingers and staining his pristine polo shirt. Brad Sullivan was on his hands and knees, gasping for air, and trying not to vomit in front of half the school. Jake Morrison had disappeared entirely, melting into the crowd of spectators who were now keeping a respectful distance from Marcus. Marcus stood in the center of the devastation, his knuckles split and bleeding, his chest heaving with exertion and adrenaline. For the first time in his life, the hallway was completely silent around him. Hundreds of students watching him with expressions ranging from shock to awe to fear. He opened his mouth to speak, to say something that would explain or justify what had just happened, but the words still wouldn't come. Then the security guards arrived, followed closely by Principal Williams and 3 teachers who'd heard the commotion from their classrooms. Marcus didn't resist as they led him away, his arms held firmly but not roughly by men who'd seen their share of teenage violence, but never anything quite like this. Behind him, he could hear Tommy Brennan being helped to the nurse's office, his nasal voice now even more distorted by the damage Marcus had inflicted. The principal's office smelled like coffee and disappointment, its wood-paneled walls lined with photographs of graduating classes stretching back decades. Principal Williams was a thin man in his 50s, whose gray hair and tired eyes suggested he'd seen every possible variation of teenage drama. But even he seemed shaken by what had transpired in his hallway. "Marcus," he began, his voice carefully neutral as he consulted the incident report that had been hastily typed by his secretary. "Do you want to tell me what happened out there?" Marcus sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair across from Williams's desk, his hands folded in his lap to hide the damage to his knuckles. The adrenaline was wearing off now, replaced by a hollow exhaustion that made his bones feel like lead. He knew he should explain about the bullying, about the months of harassment and humiliation that had led to this moment, but the words remained trapped behind the same barrier that had plagued him his entire life. I hit him," Marcus finally managed, his voice barely audible even in the quiet office. "Yes, I can see that," Williams replied, not unkindly. "What I need to understand is why." "Tommy Brennan has a broken nose, Marcus. Brad Sullivan is in the nurse's office with possible broken ribs. This isn't a schoolyard scuffle. This is serious assault." The word assault hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Marcus understood the implications, could already see the path that stretched ahead of him: suspension, possibly expulsion, criminal charges if Tommy's parents decided to press them. His mother would have to leave work to deal with this crisis, adding one more burden to her already overwhelming load. His dreams of graduating, of maybe earning a scholarship to a community college, were crumbling around him like a house built on sand. They were... Marcus started, then stopped, frustrated by his inability to articulate the years of torment that had led to this explosion. How could he explain the daily humiliation, the way Tommy and his friends had made him feel subhuman, when he couldn't even say their names without stuttering? A knock on the door interrupted his struggle. Mrs. Chun, the school counselor, entered, with a gentle smile and a folder thick with documentation. She was one of the few adults at Roosevelt who'd always treated Marcus with genuine kindness, and her presence brought a small measure of comfort to the otherwise hostile environment of the principal's office. "I've been reviewing Marcus's file," she said, taking a seat beside him with the easy grace of someone accustomed to crisis situations. "There have been several reports of bullying over the past 2 years, most of them involving Tommy Brennan and his friends." Principal Williams frowned, clearly uncomfortable with this development. "Mrs. Chun, while that may be relevant context, it doesn't excuse." "I'm not trying to excuse anything," she interrupted smoothly. "But I think it's important that we understand the full picture before we make any decisions about Marcus's future." She opened the folder and began reading from incident reports that Marcus had forgotten he'd filed. Complaints that had been dutifully documented and apparently ignored. Each report painted a picture of systematic harassment, of a student being pushed to his breaking point by peers who seemed to view his disability as entertainment. "Verbal harassment in the cafeteria on October 3rd, Mrs. Chun read. "Mimicking. Speech impediment during English class on October 10th. Physical intimidation in the hallway on October 17th. And that's just from last month." Marcus listened to the litany of his own suffering with a mixture of vindication and despair. The reports proved that he'd tried to handle the situation through proper channels, but they also highlighted how ineffective those channels had been. Each complaint had been filed, acknowledged, and promptly forgotten, leaving him to face the daily torment with no support from the institution that was supposed to protect him. "I see," Principal Williams said, his tone suggesting that he was beginning to understand the complexity of the situation. "And what actions were taken in response to these reports?" Mrs. Chun's silence was more damning than any accusation could have been. They all knew the answer. Nothing meaningful had been done to address the bullying, leaving Marcus to fight his battles alone until he'd finally fought back with his fists instead of futile complaints. The office door opened again, and Marcus's heart sank as he saw Tommy Brennan's parents enter with the kind of righteous fury that only wealthy people could muster when their children were threatened. Richard Brennan owned the largest construction company in the county, and his wife Patricia served on the school board, giving them the kind of influence that could reshape Marcus's future with a few well-placed phone calls. "I want that boy." "Arrested," Patricia Brennan declared before the door had even closed behind her. "My son has a broken nose and possible concussion. This is criminal assault, not some schoolyard disagreement." Richard Brennan was even more direct, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and wealth. "If the school can't control its violent students, we'll let the police handle it. Tommy's medical bills alone will be in the thousands, not to mention the trauma he's suffered." Principal Williams looked like a man caught between two freight trains, his administrative instincts warring with his growing understanding of the situation's complexity. Marcus could see his future hanging in the balance, dependent on whether this tired educator would choose the path of least resistance or actually stand up for a student who'd been failed by the system. "Mr. and Mrs. Brennan," Mrs. Chun interjected, her voice calm but firm, "I understand your concern for Tommy, but there are circumstances here that need to be considered. Marcus has been systematically bullied by your son and his friends for over 2 years, with multiple documented complaints that were never properly addressed." "That's ridiculous," Patricia Brennan snapped. "Tommy would never bully anyone. He's been raised better than that." The irony of her statement hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had been burning for years. Marcus wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all, at the way these people could rewrite reality to suit their needs. But even his bitter amusement was trapped behind the wall of his disability. "I have the documentation right here," Mrs. Chun continued, holding up the folder. "Verbal harassment, physical intimidation, deliberate targeting of Marcus's speech impediment. Your son and his friends have made this young man's life miserable for years." "Even if that were true," Richard Brennan growled, "it doesn't give him the right to assault Tommy. Violence is never the answer." Marcus almost choked on the hypocrisy of that statement. Violence was exactly the answer when it was delivered by popular kids against unpopular ones, when it was psychological rather than physical, when it was sanctioned by silence and enabled by indifference. But when the victim finally fought back, suddenly violence became unacceptable. The meeting continued for another hour, voices rising and falling as adult politics played out over Marcus's head. His mother arrived halfway through, still wearing her diner uniform and smelling like coffee and fried food, her face tight with worry and exhaustion. Elena Rodriguez had worked herself to the bone to give her son opportunities she'd never had. And now she sat in a chair that cost more than she made in a week, listening to wealthy people discuss her child's future as if he were a problem to be solved rather than a human being to be protected. In the end, it was Mrs. Chun who saved him. She'd been quietly making phone calls during the heated discussions, reaching out to contacts in the district office and the teachers' union, building a case for Marcus that went beyond the immediate incident. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of institutional knowledge and legal precedent. Given the documented history of bullying and the school's failure to address it adequately, I believe Marcus's actions, while regrettable, were a direct result of our institutional negligence, she said. Suspending him without addressing the underlying issues would be admitting liability that could expose the district to significant legal action. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Marcus might have thrown the punches, but the school's failure to protect him made them complicit in creating the situation that led to violence. Principal Williams understood immediately, his administrative instincts finally aligning with what was right rather than what was expedient. "Marcus will be suspended for 3 days, Williams announced, his tone suggesting the decision was final. During that time, he'll receive counseling and anger management training. Tommy and his friends will also face disciplinary action for their role in this incident, including sensitivity training and community service." It wasn't perfect justice, but it was more than Marcus had dared to hope for. As his mother led him out of the office, he caught a glimpse of Tommy Brennan in the hallway, his nose wrapped in bandages and his eyes full of hatred. The war wasn't over. If anything, Marcus had just escalated it to a new level. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel like the victim. The 3-day suspension stretched ahead of him like a prison sentence, but it also offered something precious: time away from the pressure cooker of Roosevelt High, space to think and breathe and figure out what came next. As they walked to his mother's battered Honda Civic, Elena Rodriguez squeezed her son's shoulder with a mixture of pride and concern. "Mio," she said softly, "fighting isn't the answer, but I understand why you did it. Sometimes the world pushes us until we have no choice but to push back." Marcus nodded, still unable to find the words to explain what he was feeling. The violence had released something inside him, something that felt both terrifying and liberating. For 17 years he'd been trapped by his inability to speak, defined by his limitations, caged by other people's expectations of what he could and couldn't do. But in those 30 seconds in the hallway, when his fists had done the talking that his voice couldn't manage, Marcus had discovered something powerful within himself. It wasn't just anger or frustration. It was a kind of strength he'd never known he possessed, a force that could reshape his world if he learned to channel it properly. As they drove through the familiar streets of Millbrook, past the factories and corner stores and aging apartment buildings that defined his neighborhood, Marcus stared out the window and began to imagine a different future. One where his voice might still falter, but his presence would command respect. Where bullies would think twice before targeting him, not because he was invisible, but because he was dangerous. The idea was taking shape in his mind, rough and unformed, but growing stronger with each mile. By the time they reached their apartment building, Marcus Rodriguez had made a decision that would change the trajectory of his life forever. He was going to learn to fight, not just with wild swings and desperate fury, but with skill and precision and deadly intent. The bullies at Roosevelt High had no idea what they'd unleashed, but they were about to find out. The smell of sweat and leather hit Marcus like a physical wall as he pushed through the heavy steel door of Santini's boxing gym, located in the basement of a converted warehouse in the industrial district. 3 miles from his apartment, the gym existed in a world completely separate from the polished hallways of Roosevelt High. Exposed brick walls were covered with faded photographs of fighters from decades past, their faces a mixture of triumph and brutality that spoke to the violent beauty of the sport. Heavy bags hung from rusted chains, their surfaces worn smooth by countless fists, while the rhythmic sound of gloves hitting leather created a percussion that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the city itself. Marcus had spent the first day of his suspension researching boxing gyms online, using the ancient laptop his mother had bought secondhand from a pawn shop. Most of the facilities he found were either too expensive or too focused on fitness classes for suburban housewives looking to burn calories, but Santini's was different. The website was basic, almost primitive, with a simple message that resonated. With something deep in his chest, we don't make fighters. We reveal them. Vincent Santini emerged from behind the reception desk like a character from another era. At 68, he carried himself with the measured grace of a man who'd spent 4 decades in professional boxing, first as a middleweight contender who'd gone the distance with some of the sport's legends, then as a trainer who'd guided 3 fighters to world championships. His face was a roadmap of his career, with a flattened nose that had been broken 7 times, scar tissue around his eyes that gave him a permanently squinting expression, and hands that looked like they'd been carved from oak. "You lost, kid?" Santini asked, his voice carrying the distinctive rasp of someone who'd taken too many shots to the throat during his fighting days. His dark eyes studied Marcus with the intensity of a jeweler examining a potentially valuable stone, taking in details that most people would miss. Marcus opened his mouth to explain why he was there, but the familiar constriction seized his throat, turning his carefully rehearsed introduction into a series of stuttered fragments. I want to learn to fight, he managed, his face burning with the same shame that had followed him his entire life. Santini's expression didn't change, showing none of the amusement or pity that Marcus had come to expect from adults when his speech impediment revealed itself. Instead, the old trainer nodded slowly, as if Marcus had delivered a perfectly articulate explanation of his intentions. You ever been in a real fight? Santini asked, leading Marcus deeper into the gym, past a ring where two teenagers were sparring under the watchful eye of an assistant trainer. Why yesterday, Marcus replied, remembering the explosion in Roosevelt High's hallway, the satisfying crunch of Tommy Brennan's nose beneath his fist. Win or lose? Marcus considered the question carefully. In terms of physical damage, he'd certainly won. Tommy was nursing a broken nose, Brad was dealing with bruised ribs, and Jake had disappeared entirely. But in the larger context of his life at Roosevelt High, the victory felt Pyrrhic at best. Won the fight, Marcus said slowly. Lost everything else. Santini stopped walking and turned to face him fully, his weathered features creasing into something that might have been approval. That's honest. Most kids your age think winning a fight means winning everything. You understand it's more complicated than that. The old trainer led him to a corner of the gym where a collection of mismatched chairs surrounded a desk that looked like it had survived several wars. The walls here were covered with newspaper clippings and magazine articles yellowed with age but carefully preserved behind glass frames. Marcus recognized some of the names from his research, fighters who'd trained at Santini's and gone on to championship glory, their success stories serving as both inspiration and intimidation for the current generation of hopefuls. Sit down, Santini commanded, settling into a chair that groaned under his weight despite his lean frame. Tell me why you really want to learn to fight. And don't give me some bullshit about self-defense or getting in shape. I want the truth. Marcus struggled with the question, not because he didn't know the answer, but because articulating it required him to confront feelings he'd been suppressing for years. The truth was ugly and complicated, rooted in humiliation and rage and a desperate hunger for respect that felt almost shameful to acknowledge. I'm tired of being weak, he finally said, the words tumbling out in a rush that bypassed his usual stuttering patterns. Tired of people looking at me like I'm broken. Tired of being scared all the time. Santini leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of his face as he studied Marcus with the intensity of a scientist examining a specimen. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sounds of training, the steady thump of heavy bags, the squeak of sneakers on canvas, the sharp exhalations of fighters working through combinations. You think learning to fight is going to fix your speech problem? Santini asked bluntly. The question hit Marcus like a slap, forcing him to confront the magical thinking that had driven him to seek out the gym in the first place. Part of him had indeed hoped that physical strength might somehow translate into verbal confidence, that the power to hurt others might silence the voice in his head that constantly reminded him of his inadequacy. No, Marcus admitted, his voice barely audible. But maybe it'll make people stop treating me like I don't matter. Santini was quiet for a long moment, his gaze shifting to the photographs on the wall behind Marcus's head. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that suggested he was sharing something important, something earned through decades of experience with broken people seeking salvation through violence. I've trained fighters for 40 years, he said slowly. Champions, contenders, and a whole lot of kids who thought boxing was going to solve their problems. You know what I learned? Fighting doesn't make you confident. Confidence makes you a fighter. The words settled over Marcus like a lead blanket, crushing the naive hope that had carried him through the door. He started to stand, already formulating an apology for wasting the old trainer's time, but Santini's next words stopped him cold. But, the trainer continued, I also learned that sometimes a man has to hurt people before he can heal himself. Sometimes you got to break things before you can build them right. He stood and walked to a cabinet behind his desk, returning with a pair of hand wraps that looked like they'd seen decades of use. The fabric was worn soft but still sturdy, stained with the sweat and blood of countless fighters who'd trusted Santini to guide their development. "I'm going to make you a deal," Santini said, dropping the wraps onto the desk between them. 3 months. You train here 6 days a week, 2 hours a day. You do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you, how I tell you. No questions, no excuses. No bullshit. At the end of 3 months, we'll see if you're really a fighter or just another angry kid looking for easy answers. Marcus stared at the hand wraps, understanding that they represented more than just equipment. They were an invitation into a world where words mattered less than actions, where respect was earned through pain and dedication rather than social status or family wealth. The prospect terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. "What's it? Seco cost?" he asked, thinking of his mother's tight budget and the extra shifts she'd have to work to afford training fees. Santini waved the question away with a dismissive gesture. "We'll figure that out later. Right now I want to see if you're serious about this or just playing tough guy." He led Marcus to a corner of the gym where a collection of equipment waited. Jump ropes, focus mitts, and a heavy bag that had been patched so many times it looked like a quilt made of leather and duct tape. The space smelled of decades of honest sweat, a sharp contrast to the artificial fragrances and cleaning products that dominated Roosevelt High. "First lesson," Santini announced, picking up a jump rope and handing it to Marcus. "Boxing isn't about throwing punches. It's about rhythm, timing, and endurance. You can't hurt someone if you can't catch them, and you can't catch them if you're too tired to move." The rope felt alien in Marcus's hands, the handles worn smooth by countless grips. He'd jumped rope as a child, of course, but that casual playground activity bore no resemblance to what Santini expected from him. The old trainer demonstrated first, his movements economical and precise, the rope whistling through the air in a steady rhythm that seemed effortless. 3 minutes, Santini said, starting a timer on his phone. "Don't stop, don't slow down, don't make excuses." Marcus began jumping, his movements awkward and uncoordinated compared to Santini's demonstration. Within 30 seconds he was breathing hard. By the 1-minute mark, his shoulders burned with fatigue. At 2 minutes, he stumbled and caught the rope with his feet, but Santini's sharp command kept him moving. "Don't stop. Reset and keep going." The final minute felt like an hour, his lungs screaming for air while his legs trembled with exhaustion. When the timer finally beeped, Marcus collapsed onto his knees, gasping like a fish pulled from water. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes and dripping onto the worn mat beneath him. "Pathetic," Santini announced matter-of-factly. "But not hopeless. Most kids quit after 90 seconds. You finished, which means you might have something to work with." The assessment stung, but Marcus found himself oddly encouraged by the qualifier. In Santini's world, it seemed not being hopeless counted as a minor victory. The trainer handed him a towel that smelled like industrial detergent and gestured toward the heavy bag. "Now we see if you can actually throw a punch or if yesterday was just lucky rage," Santini said, positioning Marcus in front of the bag. "Show me what you did to the kid at school." Marcus planted his feet and threw a wild right hand at the bag, putting all his weight behind the punch. His fist connected with a solid thump, but the impact sent shockwaves up his arm and the bag barely moved. Pain flared through his knuckles, unprotected by wraps or gloves, and he immediately understood why his hands had been so damaged after the fight with Tommy Brennan. "Jesus Christ," Santini muttered, shaking his head in disgust. "You're lucky you didn't break your hand yesterday. That's not fighting. That's just flailing around and hoping something connects." He positioned himself behind Marcus, his hands adjusting the younger man's stance with the precision of a sculptor working clay. "Fighting starts with your feet, not your fists." If your foundation is wrong, everything else falls apart. 4. The next hour, Santini broke down the mechanics of throwing a basic jab, deconstructing and rebuilding Marcus's understanding of violence with scientific precision. The punch wasn't a wild swing powered by emotion. It was a coordinated movement that started in the legs, traveled through the hips and shoulders, and culminated in a straight line from fist to target. Power comes from rotation, not muscle, Santini explained, demonstrating the motion in slow motion. You twist your hips, turn your shoulder, snap your wrist. The arm is just the delivery system. Marcus practiced the movement hundreds of times, throwing shadow punches while Santini corrected every aspect of his form. His stance was too wide, then too narrow. His hands were too low, then too high. His movements were too slow, then too fast, then somehow both simultaneously. By the end of the session, he was drenched in sweat and frustrated by his inability to master what seemed like a simple motion. Enough for today, Santini finally announced, though Marcus felt like he barely scratched the surface of what he needed to learn. Be here tomorrow at 4. Don't be late, don't make excuses, and don't expect this to get easier anytime soon. Walking home through the familiar streets of his neighborhood, Marcus felt the pleasant ache of muscles that had been worked in new ways. His shoulders throbbed from the jump rope session, his legs felt loose from the constant movement, and his knuckles were tender from repeated contact with the heavy bag. But beneath the physical discomfort was something else, a sense of purpose that had been absent from his life for as long as he could remember. The next 2 days of his suspension followed a similar pattern. He would arrive at Santini's gym at 4 o'clock sharp, endure 2 hours of brutal training that left him exhausted and humbled, then walk home through the darkening streets with his mind buzzing from the intensity of the experience. Each session built on the previous one, layering new techniques onto the foundation they were slowly constructing. On the second day, Santini introduced him to the concept of defense, teaching him that avoiding punches was more important than throwing them. A punch you don't see coming will always hurt more than one you do, the trainer explained, holding focus mitts while Marcus practiced slipping imaginary attacks. Boxing is chess with your fists. You gotta think 3 moves ahead. The third day brought footwork drills that made the jump rope sessions feel like rest periods. Santini had him moving around the ring in patterns that seemed designed by someone with a cruel sense of humor. Forward 2 steps. Slip left, back 3 steps. Slip right, lateral movement, pivot, reset. The combinations grew more complex as the session progressed, until Marcus felt like he was learning a violent form of dance. Footwork is everything, Santini repeated like a mantra. You can't punch what you can't reach, and you can't get reached if you're not there when the punch arrives. By the time Marcus returned to Roosevelt High on Monday morning, something fundamental had shifted in his bearing. The changes were subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. His posture was straighter, his movements more deliberate, his eyes more alert to his surroundings. The constant tension that had defined his interactions with the world for years had been replaced by a different kind of awareness, one rooted in confidence rather than fear. The hallways buzzed with whispered conversations about the fight, the story growing more dramatic with each retelling. In some versions, Marcus had sent Tommy to the hospital in a coma. In others, he'd fought off all 3 boys simultaneously, while laughing maniacally. The truth, as always, was more mundane than the mythology, but Marcus found himself oddly grateful for the exaggeration. Let them think he was dangerous. It was better than being invisible. Tommy Brennan's absence was conspicuous, his broken nose requiring surgery that would keep him out of school for the rest of the week. Brad Sullivan attended classes but kept his distance, his usual swagger replaced by a wariness that suggested he was still feeling the effects of Marcus's shoulder to his solar plexus. Jake Morrison had returned to school, but seemed to have developed a sudden interest in alternative routes through the building. ones that didn't bring him anywhere near Marcus's usual paths. The teachers treated Marcus differently too, though. Their reactions varied widely. Some seemed afraid of him, as if his violence against Tommy had revealed a dangerous instability that could explode at any moment. Others appeared almost impressed, their interactions carrying a new respect that he'd never experienced before. Mrs. Chun, the counselor, watched him with obvious concern, but also something that might have been pride. It was during lunch period that Marcus encountered his first real test of the new dynamic. He was sitting alone in his usual corner of the cafeteria, working through a geometry assignment while picking at the sandwich his mother had packed, when Ashley Martinez approached his table. Ashley was a sophomore who'd been one of Tommy's frequent targets, a quiet girl whose second-hand clothes and shy demeanor made her an easy mark for casual cruelty. "Marcus?" she said quietly, glancing around nervously as if expecting Tommy and his crew to materialize from thin air. "Can I sit with you?" The request surprised him. In 3 years at Roosevelt High, no one had ever voluntarily sought out his company. He gestured to the empty chair across from him, watching as Ashley settled herself with the careful movements of someone accustomed to avoiding attention. "I wanted to thank you," she said, her voice barely audible over the cafeteria noise, "for what you did to Tommy and his friends. They've been leaving me alone since the fight." Marcus nodded, unsure how to respond to gratitude for an act of violence. Part of him felt proud that his actions had inadvertently protected someone else, but another part wondered if he'd simply redistributed the bullying rather than stopping it entirely. "They'll probably just find someone else to pick on," he said, his stutter notably less pronounced than usual. The confidence from his training session seemed to carry over into his speech, though he couldn't understand the mechanism behind the improvement. "Maybe," Ashley agreed. "But at least it won't be me. And maybe other people will see what you did and realize they don't have to just take it anymore." Her words planted a seed in Marcus's mind, a possibility he hadn't considered. What if his violent response to Tommy's bullying had been more than just personal revenge? What if it had demonstrated to the entire school that the social hierarchy they'd all accepted as immutable could actually be challenged? Over the following weeks, the evidence for this theory began to accumulate. Students who'd previously been invisible started making eye contact in the hallways. Kids who'd been regular targets of harassment began walking with straighter spines and more confident gaits. Even some of the teachers seemed to be paying closer attention to the power dynamics in their classrooms, intervening in situations they might have previously ignored. Meanwhile, Marcus's education in violence continued with religious intensity. Santini proved to be a demanding teacher, one who believed that excellence came through repetition and suffering in equal measure. Every session began with 20 minutes of conditioning that left Marcus gasping and sweat-soaked, jumping rope, body weight exercises, and running that gradually built his cardiovascular system into something approaching athletic competence. The technical training grew more sophisticated as his basic skills improved. Santini introduced combinations that linked multiple punches together in fluid sequences, each movement flowing naturally into the next. The jab cross became second nature, followed by the jab cross hook, then more complex patterns that required him to think several steps ahead while maintaining perfect form. "Boxing is like speaking a language," Santini explained during one particularly intense session. "First you learn individual words, then phrases, then complete sentences. Eventually, if you're good enough, you'll be able to write poetry with your fists." The analogy resonated with Marcus in ways the trainer probably didn't intend. Here was a form of communication that didn't require perfect articulation or flawless pronunciation. In the ring, his fists could say things his voice never could, expressing emotions and intentions with a clarity that words had never provided. Defense remained the most challenging aspect of his training. Learning to throw punches felt natural, an extension of the rage that had been building inside him for years. But learning to avoid them required a different kind of intelligence, one that prioritized survival over aggression. Santini worked with him on slipping, ducking, and blocking, teaching him to read the subtle telegraphs that preceded every attack. Most people think defense is passive, the trainer explained while holding focus mitts for Marcus to hit. They're wrong. Good defense is aggressive. You're not just avoiding punches. You're making the other guy miss so badly that he creates openings for you to exploit. The concept clicked during a particularly intense sparring session with another student, a lean kid named Carlos who'd been training at Santini's for over a year. Carlos was technically superior in every way, his movements polished by months of dedicated practice. But Marcus was beginning to understand how to use his opponent's aggression against him. When Carlos threw a wild right hand, Marcus slipped to the left and countered with a short hook to the ribs. When the older fighter tried to follow up with a left hook, Marcus ducked under it and came up with an uppercut that snapped Carlos's head back. For the first time since he'd started training, Marcus felt like he was actually boxing rather than just surviving. Better, Santini acknowledged after the round ended. You're starting to think like a fighter instead of just reacting like a victim. The praise meant more to Marcus than any academic achievement ever had. In Santini's world, respect was earned through dedication and improvement rather than granted through accident of birth or social position. Every small advancement in his skills felt like a victory against the forces that had spent his entire life trying to diminish him. As his boxing abilities developed, Marcus began to notice changes in other areas of his life as well. His stutter, while not eliminated, became less pronounced during moments of stress. His posture improved, and with it came a sense of presence that commanded attention rather than begging for invisibility. Even his academic performance showed improvement, as if the confidence he was building in the gym was transferring to other challenges. The transformation didn't go unnoticed at home. Elena Rodriguez watched her son's evolution with a mixture of pride and concern, recognizing the positive changes while worrying about the violence that had sparked them. She'd always known Marcus was special, but she'd hoped his gifts would manifest in ways that didn't involve causing physical harm to others. "Mio," she said one evening as they shared dinner in their small kitchen, "I'm proud of how you're standing up for yourself, but I worry about where this path leads." Marcus understood her concerns. The line between self-defense and aggression was thinner than most people realized, and he could feel himself walking along it with increasing confidence. The power he was developing was intoxicating, a drug that promised solutions to problems he'd never been able to solve with words or passive resistance. "I'm not looking for trouble, Mama," he assured her, though they both knew that trouble had a way of finding young men who'd learned to solve problems with their fists. "I just want to be able to protect myself." She nodded, but her eyes remained worried. Elena Rodriguez had lived through enough violence in her own life to understand its seductive nature, the way it promised simple answers to complex problems. She'd fled an abusive relationship with Marcus's father when her son was still a toddler, choosing poverty over the daily threat of harm. The last thing she wanted was for Marcus to become the kind of man she'd spent years running from. But she also recognized that her son was becoming something she'd never seen before, confident. For the first time in his life, Marcus carried himself like someone who believed he had value, who expected to be treated with respect rather than hoping for it. The change was so dramatic that she sometimes felt like she was looking at a stranger, one who happened to share her DNA and her dinner table. The first real test of Marcus's new skills came during the third week of November, when winter's early arrival had turned Roosevelt High's parking lot into a treacherous maze of ice and slush. Marcus was walking to his mother's car after school when he heard the familiar sound of confrontation, raised voices, scattered laughter, and the distinctive tone of cruelty that he'd learned to recognize from painful experience. 3 seniors had cornered a freshman near the dumpsters behind the building. their positions calculated to block any escape routes while remaining hidden from casual observation. Marcus recognized the victim, David Chun, Mrs. Chun's nephew, a small kid with thick glasses and the kind of nervous energy that seemed to attract predators. The three seniors were nobody special, members of Tommy Brennan's extended social circle, who'd apparently decided to fill the power vacuum left by their leader's absence. "Come on, Chun," one of them was saying, his voice carrying the mock-friendly tone that bullies use to disguise their intentions. "We just want to borrow $20. You'll get it back eventually." Marcus stopped walking, his newly trained instincts analyzing the situation with cold precision. 3 against 1, the victim backed against a wall with nowhere to run. The aggressors confident in their ability to inflict harm without consequences. It was exactly the kind of scenario that Santini had taught him to recognize and evaluate. The smart move would be to keep walking, to avoid a confrontation that could easily escalate beyond his ability to control. Marcus was still learning, still developing the skills that might someday make him dangerous, but he wasn't ready to take on 3 opponents simultaneously. The rational part of his mind understood this perfectly, but rationality had never been his strong suit when it came to watching other people suffer the same humiliation he'd endured for years. The memory of Ashley Martinez thanking him for Tommy's broken nose flashed through his consciousness, along with Santini's words about thinking like a fighter instead of reacting like a victim. "Hey," Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the parking lot with surprising authority. "Leave him alone." The 3 seniors turned toward him with expressions of surprise that quickly shifted to amusement. They'd all heard about the phone fight with Tommy Brennan, of course, but seeing Marcus in person, they apparently found the stories hard to believe. He wasn't particularly large or imposing, and his second-hand clothes hardly projected an image of intimidation. Well, the apparent leader said, a thick-necked kid named Ryan Walsh, whose father coached junior varsity football. "If it isn't the little psycho who sucker-punched Tommy, you looking for round 2? Marcus walked closer, his movements measured and deliberate. Santini had taught him that positioning was everything in a fight, that controlling distance and angles could turn a disadvantage into an opportunity. 3 opponents meant he needed to avoid getting surrounded at all costs. "I said leave him alone," Marcus repeated, his stutter notably absent despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Find someone else to rob." Ryan Walsh stepped forward, apparently confident that his size advantage would be decisive. He was bigger than Marcus by at least 30 pounds, with the kind of broad shoulders that came from dedicated weight training. But Marcus could see the telegraphs in his movement patterns, the subtle shifts that Santini had taught him to recognize. "You think you're tough because you got lucky with Tommy?" Ryan sneered, moving within striking distance. "Let me show you what a real fight looks like." He threw a looping right hand that Marcus saw coming from a mile away, a textbook haymaker. That would have been devastating if it had connected. But Marcus wasn't there when the punch arrived, having slipped to the outside while simultaneously countering with a sharp jab that snapped Ryan's head back and bloodied his nose. The other 2 seniors rushed forward immediately, forcing Marcus to backpedal while throwing defensive combinations to keep them at bay. This wasn't the controlled environment of Santini's gym, where rules and supervision prevented serious injury. This was a street fight with no referee and no safety net, exactly the kind of situation that could end his boxing career before it had truly begun. But as the fight progressed, Marcus found himself thinking with the clarity that only came from months of dedicated training. When the second attacker threw a wild left hook, Marcus ducked under it and drove a right hand into his solar plexus, doubling him over and temporarily removing him from the equation. When the third kid tried to grab him from behind, Marcus used his footwork to create distance while landing short, sharp punches that discouraged further aggression. The entire confrontation lasted less than 2 minutes, but when it ended, All three seniors were either bleeding or gasping for air while Marcus stood over them with barely elevated breathing. David Chun had used the distraction to escape, his grateful thanks echoing across the parking lot as he ran toward the safety of the main building. "If I hear about you bothering him again," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying a menace that would have been impossible 6 months earlier, "we'll finish this conversation." Walking away from the beaten seniors, Marcus felt the familiar rush of adrenaline mixed with something else, satisfaction. Not the wild, uncontrolled rage that had driven his attack on Tommy Brennan, but a calm sense of justice served. He'd used his skills to protect someone weaker, transforming his personal vendetta into something approaching heroism. The incident cemented his reputation as Roosevelt High's most dangerous student, but it also marked the beginning of something larger. Word spread quickly through the school's social networks, carried by witnesses and embellished by imagination, until Marcus Rodriguez became a figure of legend. Students who'd never spoken to him began nodding respectfully in the hallways. Teachers started treating him with the kind of cautious respect usually reserved for older students with gang affiliations. More importantly, the bullying that had plagued Roosevelt High for years began to diminish noticeably. Predators who'd operated with impunity suddenly found themselves looking over their shoulders, wondering if their next victim might have a protector willing to settle disputes with violence. The ecosystem of cruelty that had seemed so permanent was being disrupted by a single student who'd refused to accept his assigned role as victim. Santini noticed the change in Marcus during their training sessions, recognizing the subtle signs of a fighter who'd tested his skills in real combat. The old trainer didn't ask directly about what had happened, but his knowing look suggested he understood the transformation taking place in his student. "You're starting to move like someone who's been in actual fights," Santini observed during a particularly intense sparring session. "That's good and bad. Good because real experience teaches lessons you can't learn from drills. Bad because it means you're looking for trouble." Marcus absorbed the criticism without argument, understanding that Santini was warning him about the seductive nature of violence. Every successful fight made the next one easier to justify until a person could find themselves solving every problem with their fists, regardless of whether force was actually necessary. "I'm not looking for trouble," Marcus replied, echoing the words he'd used with his mother. "But I'm not running from it anymore either." The trainer nodded slowly, recognizing the fine distinction between aggression and assertiveness. In his decades of experience, he'd seen young fighters struggle with this balance, some becoming victims of their own success, while others learned to use their skills judiciously. "Just remember," Santini said, "every punch you throw changes you a little bit. Make sure you're changing into someone you can live with." As winter deepened and Marcus's training intensified, he began to understand what the old trainer meant. The power to hurt people was intoxicating, offering simple solutions to complex social problems, but it also isolated him from normal teenage experiences. His classmates either feared him or wanted to use him, leaving little room for genuine friendship or connection. But for the first time in his life, Marcus Rodriguez was exactly where he wanted to be, respected, feared, and completely in control of his own destiny. The stuttering boy who'd counted tiles to avoid eye contact was gone, replaced by someone who commanded attention through presence rather than begging for invisibility through silence. The transformation was far from complete, but the foundation had been laid. In the boxing gym's brutal honesty, Marcus had found not just physical skills but a new understanding of himself and his place in the world. The bullies at Roosevelt High had awakened something in him that they could never put back to sleep, and soon the entire world would understand the mistake they'd made in underestimating the quiet kid with the broken voice and the unbreakable will. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.